Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility and the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. This week's episode is sponsored by Embodied Agility. Embodied Agility is my agility consultancy, and I help your teams collaborate better by providing training, coaching and mentoring for your leaders and teams. Wherever your organization is in its life cycle, from startup to supergiant, better collaboration helps you build better products quicker, cheaper and easier. And Embodied Agility is here to help. If you enjoy the kind of things I say on this podcast and discuss with my guests, you might like working with me through Embodied Agility. So, if you want to book a free 1-hour coaching and exploration session, go to embodiedagility.co.uk. This week's guest is Tobias Mayer. Tobias is a long-term citizen of the Agile space, a writer, a mentor, a teacher, and a speaker. He's committed to the liberation of the corporate workplace, and to that end, he frequently thinks, talks, writes, and offers workshops to inspire grassroots initiatives. Tobias has a varied and raggedy past, or even a ragged past. We can discuss whether it's ragged or raggedy, including many years as a software developer and a tester.
I like raggedy. You go for
raggedy.
That.
We're going to go for raggedy. He has been a student of theology for the past 20 years and is currently training to become a human givens psychotherapist. Welcome, Tobias.
Hello. Good to be here, Daniel.
Tobias, one of the ways that you describe yourself in the introductions that I've heard you give to yourself over the last few years is as a Christian, as a person of faith. What does that mean to you?
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? What does it mean? Well, first of all, I wasn't born into faith. I wasn't born into a Christian family. My family were, I don't know what they were. I wouldn't call them atheists, just kind of agnostic, really. My mother's actually Jewish by heritage, so technically I'm a Jew. Say technically, what does that mean? By birth, I am a Jew.
according to the Jews.
According to the Jews, right? So her mother never was either. I made the mistake once of telling this to somebody, and I said, "Therefore, I'm half Jewish." And he was a Jewish man. He got very offended. He said, "You cannot be half Jewish. You're either Jewish or you're not." He said, "Which are you?" I said, "I'm Jewish."
There's a Groucho Marx line where he was. He says he was refused entry to a club for being Jewish, and he said, "My son's half Jewish. Can he come in up to the waist?"
Nice. Yeah, Groucho Marx. I was going to quote him actually. Groucho Marx also said, "I never want to belong to a club that will have me as a member." And I was thinking that, and I think, why am I a Christian? It's a big enough club with enough weirdness of people and mixture of kinds of types of people that I feel okay being part of that club. Because let's face it, any faith is a club, isn't it? It's just a very big club, lots of people. So I came to Christianity actually through recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. That's where I came into faith. People who watch this might know about 12-step programs, which some people like and some people have an aversion to. But it's quite a God-centered program. It was developed through Christian faith, essentially through the book of James and the Gospel of probably Luke most prominently. And so some of the advice that comes through that is advice to get well, and it since the early 1930s it seems to have worked very well for an awful lot of people. So I thought, well, there's something in that, let me explore that further. And I just started reading, and I became very fascinated with the whole story of theology, really, the whole theological story going all the way back to the beginnings. And I've read the Bible kind of cover to cover more than once, and I dip into it periodically and study it, and I read it and I write about it, and the more I do that, the more I find lessons for our time in there, and for our time and for whatever context I happen to find myself in at the moment, whether it's a family context or work context. I can discover metaphors or stories within scripture that really help me to kind of navigate my way through the world. And so I suppose that's where my faith is. I found a place where I feel at home, in lots of different ways. I don't agree with everything. I don't agree with all the dogma, but I've kind of just given myself to it. And in terms of, I use the term embrace the mystery. I don't. I spent a lot of time disagreeing with things and finding fault and arguing, and trying to find other people who kind of thought about these stories in the way I did, about the resurrection and things like that. How can that be true? And these days I don't do that. I just embrace it. I just say, okay, this is the mystery. It's a mystery, and we can't solve it. We don't know. We weren't there. What does it mean? And I think that's a much more interesting question than did it really happen? I think that's a stupid question, and it's a pointless question because you can't answer it. Did it really happen? It doesn't matter. What does it mean? That's a much more interesting question. And so that's my faith. My faith is that quest. What does it mean? Why did we inherit that tradition 2,000 years later, still alive, very powerful in lots of ways, very destructive also, has been very destructive, and yet it persists, and I think there's something quite remarkable and quite wonderful in that. And not just Christianity, I mean, going way back past, before that, right back to the story of Genesis and the creation of the world, and the arguments people have about, well, it can't possibly have happened that way. Does it really? Of course not. Of course it didn't. But does it matter? Is it worth arguing about it? People who take the Bible literally are fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist atheists. They both take the Bible literally, and they argue about it, about whether it was true or not. And I stay well away from that. So I realised that once when I was reading. I used to read a lot of Richard Dawkins, by the way, and I liked his biological works very much. And it's sort of like some of his theology stuff, but was turned off quite quickly to that. When I realised that the God that Richard Dawkins doesn't believe in is the same God that most Christians I know don't believe in either. So there's an awful lot of agreement in that, but a lot of wasted time arguing about factual stuff, arguing about the literalness of it. We get away from that, then there's magic, there's wonder and there's miracle in that. And I think that without that in our lives, without that sense of the miraculous and the wonder, I think we lead very dull lives. And my life has certainly lifted in considerably through the embrace of that. So that's why I identify with it, and let people make of it what they will.
Yeah.
I'm not here to convert anyone else, my ways of thinking.
And people who are, I guess, followers of yours in the Agile space, or both of the followers of mine, maybe, in the Agile space, might be wondering why the two of us are here talking about faith and Christianity and God and things that I would say traditionally haven't occupied a large chapter of the How to Be a Good Scrum Master textbook. And you and I have been working on a project over the last couple of months of a meetup where we get together and we talk with people about scripture. I come from the Jewish background and studied in that tradition, and would describe myself probably as some sort of atheist or non-theist, but also sort of see the beauty in and the resonance of the stories in the scriptures. And these are opportunities for us to play and to find meaning in our lives, in our work, and if we open ourselves up to them. And it's been a really fun exploration to say, what happens if we take the story of the Exodus and we bring it to an Agile context? What does liberation mean in the context of Agile teams?
Those have been good sessions, and we're due to do one soon, I think, aren't we? You need to just pick the scripture for it. But yeah, it does. I think, and it's great that the people joining are not necessarily of either faith or any faith at all, and but open-minded enough to engage and discover and learn. So it's I have to remind myself that Jesus wasn't a Christian either, so quite important, isn't it?
Yeah. So if someone was listening to us at this point and said, this is supposed to be about Agile and cognitive science and human understanding and intelligence, why should I think about religion and faith there? What kind of answers might come to mind for you?
Well, I think the forerunner of science is religion. I think faith, if you like. The fact that people had faith meant that they were curious and they wanted to find out more and discover. And so, if we go back and look at some of the early creation myths, not just the Jewish creation myth, but the many other creation myths in the world, they're all fantastical. But they are the best sense that people could make out of what they knew at the time. They used what they knew and what they could understand, and the minimal ability they had to see the world and to see the universe, and they put together something that made sense for them at the time. And so I don't think we should be dismissing that too quickly, because that's their story. It's their culture, it's their story, it's their history, and it's their belief, or was. And as we learn more, we understand things differently, and we can change those original stories. And we've got our own myth at the moment about the Big Bang theory. It's not completely proven to be absolutely true without a doubt. There's some mystery about it still, but it's the best we can do at the time. The Big Bang theory is our best. That's the best we can have to offer. The Genesis story was the best that people had to offer. When was that written? 6,000 years ago? Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't written down actually at that time. It was only spoken, wasn't it? It wasn't written down until much later. But yeah. So, what was the question? How does it matter? How does it relate to to mind and
agile teams and the kind of work that we are engaged in as our professional jobs?
Well, I think holistically, we're looking at when we're introducing Scrum or any form of agility into an organization. The way I think about it is we're focused on holistic ways of working, all right, away from this sort of narrow if this then that sort of approach to work, and trying to embrace the whole. And I think the structure of Scrum does a really good job of that. The fact that you can't break the framework of Scrum down much further, it's sort of, you can't really talk about one part of Scrum without talking about all of the rest of it. It kind of implies a holistic model there. And I think that, a holistic person is a person who has a mind, they have a body, and they also have a spirit. We don't know much about that. We know quite a lot about the body. We have done for a very long time. We're learning more and more about the mind and the way people think and how our brain works, which is what you talk a lot about. You studied a lot. And then there's this spirit of the person that we know very little about. And so we make stuff up. And we have done that for centuries and centuries. We just make stuff up. And some of it turns out to be quite accurate, actually, the way we think about the spirit of people. And so I think that let's not neglect that part of it. We've got mind, body, and spirit. There's the three parts of the human. So I think if we're encouraging agility in an organization, I would say let's just pay some attention to that, whatever that means in each of you in your context. And it's not religion. It's not about religion. It's about spirit. And we can just identify something more than just the way we think and the way we show up physically. There's something else going on there. And if we can tap into that, we tend to start developing really good relationships, trusting relationships.
So what are some of the ways in which someone's spirit might show up in their work? Why would that be relevant to teams?
Well, I think in terms of our value systems that we have, it's the traditional organization tends us towards deceit and cheating and lying and competition and one-upmanship. That's what it tends us towards, because it puts models in place that force us to be competitive. We're measured in certain ways and we perform to the measures. And that is like, I'm more important than everyone else in my organization, because if I don't get the reward, someone else will get it, and I'll be angry about that, and I won't be able to work properly. So there's a lot of focus on all of that kind of thing. And I think that reassessing our value system and ask, what really matters. And Scrum and XP both offer, in the original presentations, they both offered a value system as well. It wasn't just I do this work in this way. It was show up like this. So it's about showing up. showing up with integrity and showing up with an open mind and with courage. No one's really thought about that in the corporate world before. Courage, we haven't really thought about that. Everyone's very scared. Managers most of all, I would say. The higher you go up in the hierarchy, the more frightened you are, because everyone knows about the Peter Principle, which is a real thing. We do get promoted to our level of incompetence. It's kind of obvious almost that we do. And so when you get there, there's a very frightening place to be, because that you're not really up to the job, and you're frightened of everyone else finding out, right? So the problem with the knowledge work industry is that people think they ought to know stuff. That's the biggest problem with the knowledge work industry. So you get promoted to this position of manager, and you think, oh my goodness, I've got to know. I've got to have answers, right? And so when someone asks me something, I have to have an answer. So we bluster a lot. And, this whole thing about setting distant goals and fixing things and nailing them down and having product requirements documents is all about trying to live up to this idea as I have to know. Right? It's this sort of fake knowing that we present to the world here. This is what it's going to be like. It's like saying this is what the future is going to be like. And I know because I'm a manager. And I can't listen to anyone who disagrees with me about that. And the thing about the key difference, when people ask me what's the difference between the traditional way of working, they call it waterfall, which is incorrect, but skip that for a minute. And say, what's the difference between waterfall and agile? And I say, well, the traditional defined approach to work is that people assume to know. And the agile approach to work is we start off by saying, I don't know. So that's it. That's the difference, right? And it changes everything. It really does.
And there's something that religions have discovered in the thousands of years of their existence about those values, about things like courage, about the ways that we approach the unknown and the infinite, that are useful to us as humans and therefore are useful to us in our work. So is it right to say that it's worth talking, or is it a fair reflection of your view that it's worth talking about religion and these the tools and the philosophy and the thinking that has come from the world of religion, because it has helped us uncover things as humanity, values, and it's helped us think about those things that we do need in our workplace, and we're only realizing we need those things in the last 10, 20, 30 years, more and more. Religion can help us show.
I think that's fair. But I think that a lot of non-religious people would say, well, we have that ability anyway. We can, we don't have to have a religion in order to do that, which is true.
Are you saying, Tobias Mayer, only religious people can be courageous?
Well, exactly. Of course I'm not, it's, that's what I'm saying. It's like we have those, people would argue that we already have those things. We don't need religion in order to be courageous. We don't need religion in order to be honest or to be forthright or to be kind or to be compassionate. We don't need religion for that. I agree. But what people forget, I think, is that we've been imbued in a spiritual tradition for thousands and thousands of years. And we can't just brush it off. It's not. I know it's not technically in our genes, but I almost would say it's in our genes. We're raised. The culture, the memes around us, right? Everything that we're surrounded with is of that faith tradition. And so it's almost impossible, I would say, to be completely indifferent to all of that. And so when we show up with love or compassion or kindness, we've got our long history and tradition through our ancestry of that coming from a place of faith. We might reject the word faith and religion now, but we're still showing up with it. Can't help it. So we can say, yes, you don't need to be a religious person. Some of the, so there's obviously loads of lovely people in the world who claim non-theism, like you just said, non-theist or atheism or agnosticism. I'm not really sure of what the nuances of all these things are. But I think that, and I have no problem with anyone identifying in any way they want. What I do have a problem with, or I struggle with rather, is when people close their minds. And this is true of religious people and non-religious people. A closed mind, you can't work with, can you? You can't work with someone like that. Which is why openness is one of the values in Scrum. It's like we've got to be open to new ways of thinking and new ideas. And it's too easy to shut yourself down to that, and by shutting other people down, by refusing to hear or to engage, because we experience this not just in religious terms, but there was a short anecdote. One of the communities I'm part of, the trainer communities, at the time in 2016, 2017, more than one of the people on that list said they would refuse to work with anyone who voted for Trump. Like, flat out refusal. Anyone who voted for or supports in any way or says a kind thing about, I won't work with that person. I mean, it's a difficult position to put yourself in, because how do you really, from the start, how do you know how people voted? Is it that black and white? I posted something recently on one of our own groups about something that Trump said that I agreed with. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything that Trump says, and this is this black and white thinking that we've fallen into. It's like, oh, have you said that you like Trump? You voted for, you care about, so you're a right wing this, and suddenly I'm painted with this brush that means I agree with everything that Trump says and everything that the extreme right says, and I don't. I agreed with one thing. I might agree with something else at some other point in time, but I think that we need to learn subtlety again. We've lost the art of subtlety and nuance so badly. Is that we're either on this polarization that is being created in the world that got tenfold enhanced during COVID times as well.
I think if we think about the ways in which humanity has approached the question of how do I relate to the other, even if they're different from me or even if they disagree with me, we're really thinking, and if we value that and we say, well, we should all be one mankind and one species, and we should treat each other fairly, and that's a very Christian idea. That's like OG Jesus speak there. So potentially the reason why we value that, seeing people despite their labels and despite some of their beliefs and despite our associations, well, you could say that's a very biblical way of seeing people. That's a very Christian way of seeing people, all children of God equally, and we have so much in common. And there's plenty in scientific only traditions that was genocidal, and there's also that in biblical traditions as well, of course. But to sort of map those things squarely as if a rational, scientific only anti-religious worldview is inherently humane. The reason probably why you think that the word humane is a good thing probably has its roots in religious traditions and religious ideas in the past.
Yeah, I think so. But it's I wandered off in that tangent, I think, when we were talking about being open-minded, right? So embracing what's not known, what's not understood. And I think that we need to promote that in our workplaces, if nowhere else. I mean, of course, everywhere else too, but we have the power, if you like, you and I and people like us doing the work we do, to be able to introduce those ideas more strongly in organizations and have people listen to one another, and not just dismiss someone for saying, I voted this way, or, I think this is a good idea, Brexit's a good idea. Suddenly everything about that person is sort of written off. Like, this is not a person worth talking to. And the person doing that action, lose so much by not engaging. You might think you're, I don't know, keeping your boundaries or something, and there's something to that, certainly. But I heard a lovely phrase that said, if you're too open-minded, your brains fall out. And I think that's good. It's a good thing to remember. We can't just embrace everything. There's a need for boundaries and there's a need for integrity. But we can have both of those things and still listen. Right? So having my boundaries and my integrity shouldn't prevent me from listening. It will keep me from, put a barrier up between me trying to be sucked into another way of thinking, because that happens quite easily, doesn't it? If you get enough people who say one thing or think one thing, it's easy to just kind of fall into that cult thinking kind of thing. So boundaries are important, but I think that they shouldn't stop us respecting and listening to someone else's perspective, especially if it's presented in a non-violent way. just hearing people.
And that's such a fundamental collaborative skill in the kind of cross-functional teams we work in, being able to take people and their contribution and incorporate it into the kind of work that we end up doing. And one of the things I'm interested in talking about religion more at work is a lot of people are coming to work with religious values, religious assumptions, religious faith. But it's much easier to run a retrospective about Harry Potter than it is about Christmas or about something like that. Or if you do Christmas, it's, Santa or something like that, which I would argue is like not a particularly religious element of Christmas. But we can talk about the cultural stuff. But when we think about, or it's very capitalo-pagan view of religion. But if we think about what are the things that actually motivate people about their faiths, which are cherished and really important to them, well, all of a sudden we leave that at the door because it's a taboo. And maybe that's a taboo that came about for good reason, because we don't want people feeling pressurized to be religious at work or to be part of their manager's faith or something like that, which is mad. But we've overcorrected another way in which it's very rare to be able to say, do you know what's really important about me when I show up is that I am a devout Muslim and I am really into that. And I don't know that many spaces where that would, and replace whichever faith you like there, where that would feel like a comfortable thing to say. And I think that means people leave a lot of their own humanity at the door where they needn't to. And we need to be able to create spaces where if I want to show up at work, I personally show up in many ways that are unspecified as like a Jewish agile developer, agile coach, whatever my job's called. And I might want to like bring an analogy from my like cultural world, and that makes me a better contributor to my team. So we need to be able to find those paths in for people.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's really important. And it's interesting, as you were saying that about leaving your faith at the door. If you're a person of faith, you're a Christian or you're a Jew, do you want that to be known in your organization? If you do, then I think we should be supporting that and letting people have that space to have that conversation.
Yeah,
because we don't have the outward presentation of it.
It's a maybe as a question also about just like intercultural, interfaith dialogue in Britain or in our world as well. Because every organization that I've worked for, maybe I've just been lucky, is when someone says, this week I'm celebrating Hanukkah, this week I'm celebrating Eid. There's like celebratory emojis and like, yay, that's great for you. How can we accommodate? Brilliant. I don't want to really ask you about it. I don't want to offend you. I don't want to like ask a dumb question. You think that, so in the name of tolerance, let's like leave it at the stuff that you want to say about it and maybe no more. And maybe that's just like a really reasonable and pragmatic and like humane opinion, and not everyone wants to be like pestered about their faith at work. Yeah. I definitely don't want to be pestered about anything at work, but maybe there's a middle ground as well where we can invite really enriching conversations about like what are the things that really inspire you, and you don't just have to have bland atheist examples of things that you expect everyone else will resonate with. Like it should be all right to show up at work and say, one of my leader role models is like, I don't know, Rabbi Akiva from the Talmud, because he did this cool stuff in this mad story, and I don't expect really any of you to care about that, but I do, and now you know something about me, or something like that. Not even saying that I would want to do that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I do it. I mean, invite it, because it actually works. I mean, I've done workshops where I've invited almost exactly what you're describing there, is tell me who your hero is. Let's do a presentation about someone. It's not just any old hero. It's usually a hero who's a confrontational hero, someone who's confronting society in some way, or standing up for what they believe in, the courage, looking at courage in that way. Who does that? And people come up with examples that they care about. Rosa Parks might come up, for example. Someone might cite her as being an example of a courageous person. But I've certainly had religious figures come up in that, and from different people of different faiths. And people listen, and it's interesting because it gives you information that you might not know and learn. And so it does create a lovely learning space. And because you set it up right, it gives people permission to do that. We're not limiting it. You can't talk about religion, or you can't talk about this or that. It's just open. Who do you care about? And you can do it for asking people to bring a piece of prose or poetry that's inspired them. Something that you might have on your fridge at home that you see every day and that we don't know about. Tell us what that is. And there's lots of wonderful things out there, aren't there, that people get inspired by quotes and poems and things, and to share those with the group. It's like you're one thing, you're giving education, right? You're educating each other, and you're doing what you just said, is like bringing people into your world a little bit more. This is who I am. Get to know me a little bit better. And so if we create the space where people can do more than just put an emoticon to say, happy Eid or whatever, but I think people would enjoy that, actually. I think sometimes people are quite happy to be asked questions about these things. It can get a bit tedious after a while. When people ask me, well, what do you mean by God? Explain God to me. I'm not going to do that. And it's a boring thing, for me to even attempt it, because it's immediately toxic. And my response is usually that it's a mystery and I don't understand it. It doesn't mean that I don't believe it. I just don't understand it. But there are other kinds of questions. How did you come to your faith? Like you asked me, how did you come to that faith? I didn't. How do you show up as a Christian? Do I show up differently now that I've been identified as a Christian for pretty much the whole 20, 30 years or something like that. Quite a long time now. And it's been a slow process of just kind of like reaching where I am now. What does it mean in practice? It means that I go to church every week, and it means that I try to get involved in the community there. And it means that I read the Bible with my children and my partner every night, almost every night. We have a book, which should show you. The Children's Bible in 365 stories. We read that. We read a story from that every night, and it's like reading. It is reading stories. The book is written as a series of stories, and then we talk about it. We talk about this story, this horrible thing of this whole tribe being murdered or something like that. Okay, well, let's talk about that. We're not just going to read it and put it aside. It's like if you read a Grimm's fairy tale to your children, with all the horror that those come with. You wouldn't just read it and put it away. I think you would read it and have some level of processing. Or which character did you feel you could identify within that story? What do you think they should have done if they? What would have been different if they'd done this? And just engage in some sort of conversation about it. But that's a way of me, kind of keeping the faith tradition, the stories alive in myself and my family. We talk a lot. With the children, they're just about to turn 9 and 11 now, about what it means to be a Christian, and not forcing it on them in any way, and asking them what they are there, because they ask us questions too. They go, I don't really understand how if Jesus comes back to life, how he's not like a vampire, or some stuff like that.
It's like, oh, cool. So he was a zombie, like, yeah, kind of, but also not. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they're trying to process it, and I think the idea of trying to process the unprocessable is good. It's good life learning, actually, processing the unprocessable. We live in an age where we think we have to have answers to everything, otherwise it's invalid. Like if it isn't true, it's invalid. But we misunderstand truth, I think, and think of like factual truth, data-driven truth is the only kind of truth. If we can verify it empirically, then it could be true. But otherwise, if you can't do that, it's not true. Which dismisses a whole category of wisdom from the world if you say that.
Things that may not be like true, untrue, but are still useful and necessary. And there's something that you said just now in you might look at this book and say they're just stories. And I think for me, that word story is the one that relates to religion most frequently for me, and both for the people who denigrate it and for the people who practice it. They say, well, that's just a bunch of stories, right? It's a bunch of children's stories about how we understood the world 1100 years ago, and we're better than those stories now. We've got science. And our whole humanity is based on the stories that we tell about the world, about ourselves. Like, stories are pregnant with all this meaning that sits at the unspoken levels. If I tell you a story, I communicate way more than the words in that story. So yeah, religion consists of important stories that we absolutely need in order to survive. And religions contain books of stories that we pass on or we don't pass on. But if you don't, you're going to have to pass on other stories. And those stories are not going to be any more true than the ones that you think you rejected when you stopped going to Sunday school.
That's right. Yeah, we live in story, don't we? I mean, we're creating stories all the time. What was that statement? Something about the future is uncertain. And I can't remember who said it. He said the past is uncertain also. It's equally uncertain. So we think the past is true, but our memories of it are so vague and wrong. We remember things wrongly more often than we remember things correctly. Remember it from a perspective. My memory of a situation will be one thing. It's like that lovely Charles Aznavour song. There's a duet. I can't remember who the other one is, and they're singing about their first meeting, and he's remembering certain things, and she corrects him every time. We were in this restaurant. No, we were in that restaurant. I remember you had, a ribbon in your hair. No, I didn't. I had my hair was tied up. So there's this sort of totally different set of memories for each one of those things. And I think that's like the past is uncertain. So you can't just say look at it and say it's true because it's recorded in history. I mean, that's a joke in itself. Whose history? The history is written by the well, people say written by the winners, but also written by the ruling classes, isn't it? So we have no idea what the history of the working class person is at all. That's sidelined. So there's not a lot of truth around, really, to be honest, is there? There's certain things we remember and certain things we can prove to be empirically true right now with the data that we have. But we must always remember that we don't know everything. And it's so arrogant to think that the statements people make, like the science is out, the science is, it's like contradictory. The science is completed. Science isn't ever completed. No science is ever completed. That's what makes it science. It's investigation. So to say everything's known that can be known about this particular topic, whether it's COVID or something else, this is exactly what we must do. I mean, that showed us really how little we do know about pretty much everything, didn't it? All the mistakes that were made during those years and the tragic mistakes people made during that time.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me about looking at this from a cognitive science point of view is the idea that we have sort of finite data processing abilities in our brains. And what we see of the world is a very small fragment that is afforded to us of an infinitely data-rich reality that we could never possibly experience in its fullness. So we exclude and we narrow things down and we frame things in certain perspectives. And our whole cognition ability is our ability to take infinite stuff and take little slices of it to make meaning for ourselves. And so that's why we do things like telling stories. We pull out certain facts from an infinite situation and make it into a salient pattern that is worth repeating. But we know that we necessarily exclude some of that infinity whenever we do that.
I think that's a great point, actually, what you just said about how we use story in that way. So we tell stories about the past rather than trying to capture it factually, because the story is true, usually. It's true in a metaphorical way. So a story can encompass many different viewpoints and perspectives, and people will recall it in the story in different ways. But there's a lot more truth, I think, in a story of the past than there is about any accurate historical recording of it, because that's only ever a single perspective. Whereas a story does, the style of storytelling tends to embrace the whole more effectively. So you've got more voices within a story than you would have in a historical report.
The way that people talk about Agile and Scrum and Kanban, they tell stories about it, right? 20 software developers got together in the Snowbird Resort in Utah and wrote the Agile Manifesto, and they came down from the mountain. And we have religious tools of how we handle important stuff. And anyone that says, no, I'm not like religious about my Agile stuff, well, then you haven't really been listening.
Yes, I know. You haven't been listening. I know. That is so true, isn't it? About, coming down from the mountain with the truth on these, not on stone tablets, but out of an old-fashioned internet page, as it looks
Yeah.
now. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there was a moment. It was an important moment, and telling the story about that is good. And people do pilgrimages to Snowbird
Really?
to go to that hotel where it was really, yeah, people actually do that. They went back on the 20-year anniversary and stuff, so they take it seriously. And probably most of those people, if you asked if they had a religion, they'd probably say, no, I'm an atheist.
Don't be ridiculous. I'm a rationalist. Yeah.
Yeah. I heard someone, I think there might be some truth in it, in that nobody is not religious. We are all religious. It's just we choose different religions, right? So we say I'm not a Christian or a Jew, but I'm something. I worship. It's more about worship. But what do you worship? I worship. People do worship. Most of us worship money and possessions and ownership. That's our God. Mammon is our God these days, and so we all have something outside of ourselves that we look to, because we can't live otherwise. We can't live only in ourselves. The search for meaning and purpose means going out of yourself and looking at bigger things, and so if we haven't got that through faith, we find it in another way. Make our own faith up, essentially.
It could be that David Foster Wallace speech. Maybe I'll link to it in the show notes, but it's David Foster Wallace was an American writer who killed himself in, I think, in 2008, and he wrote some beautiful books, and he gave what became quite a famous graduation speech to a college that he was invited to, called "This Is Water," where he talks about there's the parable of two fish swimming in the water, or they're swimming in a fish bowl, and third fish comes past and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they say, "What's water?" And we're so used to certain things that are normal for us. And he basically goes on a exploration of, like, how do we create meaning in the world, and how do we choose how to live our lives. And ultimately, whether you worship Yahweh or Jehovah or Allah or the Four Noble Truths or something like that, we have to almost inherently, or the scientific principles of whatever, or the Agile Manifesto, or the Darwin's theory of evolution, or whatever, we put our energy into something and we tell stories about it and we make that a meaningful endeavor. And that's just how we have to live our lives. And in that way, we all worship, even if we wouldn't say that we worship God or we worship religion. And if we think that that's not possible, let's look at how these, I say these kind of dismissively, but let's see how rationalist, atheist, self-defining, agile folk will make a pilgrimage to the Snowbird ski resort to create a meaningful path through their lives. And I'm sure we do various other versions of that.
Yeah. And that's, this search for meaning and purpose is one of the noblest things we can engage in, I think. If we don't have that, we get very lost. And so we make that meaning in the best ways, in many different ways that we can. And faith for many people is one of those ways. It might be the primary way, but I would never say it's the only way. Faith without works is dead. I think that's an important statement from the book of James. It's like, it's okay to believe and fine, but if you're not actually doing anything with that faith, then it's dead. It's not useful. It's not valuable to anybody. So if people who sort of find Jesus and their life is great, well, if they're not doing anything with this finding of Jesus except talking about how they found Jesus, then they're not really a useful member of society, are they? They're not really they're not actually living up to the faith they claim to have. So I think that it's always important to remember that, and that's where the meaning might start with the discovery of finding Jesus or whatever it is, converting to Islam or some awakening moment. But then you've got to do something with it. You've got to sit back and do nothing. You have to engage in the world.
From a work point of view, it's the difference between the people who will go around saying, no, the Agile Manifesto, no, it's all about the theory and these things, but not really have any sense of how to be in a working team who are trying to get shit done. Versus the people who are all about working in the team, but don't have any orientation to a higher set of values, versus the people that can somehow straddle both of those domains.
Yeah, which should be all of us.
We should be all of those things, but it's sometimes we go towards our strengths, right? And some people who are more oriented towards tools and techniques and things will go into the detail, and people who are maybe bigger thinkers or different kinds of thinkers might sit at the value. But doing either of those in the extreme is ultimately not helpful. And I think that's kind of how the agile world has found itself at the constant existential crisis that it finds itself in, that orienting between impractical but useful values versus very pragmatic but not more broadly integrated tools. And we just found ourselves shouting into the wind a lot of the time. As someone leading a team, how can they incorporate this stuff we've been talking about? Meaning, purpose, storytelling, faith. How might that help them be a better team leader, a better engineering manager, a better software developer, a better contributor to a cause?
Each in a different way, first of all. I don't think there's just one path to this. One of the things that some of the more successful teams I've worked with were just people who were good at their job and they cared about each other. So bringing Scrum into an environment like that is a breeze, and it's really fun and great. People are very open to new ideas. I was thinking of one team, we used to meet once a week, the whole company. It was a small company, it was like 20, 30 people, and just do a learning day. And it would be like, I don't know, it was 2 hours or something like that. It wasn't the whole day. And we would just explore different things. And I suppose in a situation, if you create a forum where that's an accepted practice, everyone knows they're not going to do work for those 2 hours, they're just going to engage in some improving idea or conversation that's going to help them understand each other better or learn new things. And so you can use that forum to embrace anything. You can say, today we're going to do that exercise we talked about earlier. Let's talk about heroes. Who are we influenced by? Let's have a look at that, because we've never had that conversation, and I've got no idea who that new developer who just joined. I don't know what his background is or what influences him. And asking someone, rather than sort of go through your resume, go through your CV and tell us all your previous jobs, it's so boring. I don't want to know that. I want to know, like, who influences you. What book did you read that changed your life? Or something like that, and I think we all have moments like that. What was that? It's like the, in storytelling terms, it's the until one day moment. Everything kind of like is normal. And until one day, how you read a book or you see a person or you have a meeting or you fall in love and suddenly everything's new and different. And then a whole new story begins. And if we can tap into that with the people we work with, it's so generative and exciting to finally feel like, oh gosh, that, I know something really important about that person now, and I look at them with different eyes. And so it doesn't take much to just it's about creating the container for that, so let's make a container that we know that this is what the boundary conditions are, this is what we may do inside of that. And so just show up with an open mind and let's see what happens. Or, I could prep it in advance, and it might be you as the coach or me as the coach who starts that. But as we progress, other people will pick up the reins and start to facilitate these things for themselves, which is, of course, what we ultimately want, is for organizations to do this for themselves. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is, and I've found this, I've been doing this for a few years now, is using the 5 Scrum values in retrospective. So rather than saying what worked and what didn't work, you ask the question, how well did you live up to the 5 values of Scrum? And you look at it on a scale, perhaps. I've written about this, is the 5 Scrum values and their 5 opposites, right? So the anti-values, if you like. If you're like, for example, with focus, its anti-value would be distraction, wouldn't it? So if you're not focused, you are distracted. And so at any given time, we're doing either one or the other. But over time, you find there's a scale. Yeah, I did in this last week. I was way more focused than I was distracted. Or another time might be my life was full of distractions this week. And so you're using the scale of these values to sort of assess where you are um, individually and or as a team in terms of living up to the values that you say you're embracing because you say you're doing Scrum. So it makes it quite real. And I find it a really powerful way of reflecting on what has been and how you're going to improve. So if you've got a whole team who's saying, yeah, it was a distracting week, these things were happening and they took us away from the focus. So how do we avoid that next time? What do we do differently if that situation occurs next time? So that's quite a powerful way of doing it. And when you ask people to start exploring the values, first of all, you might find some differences of what those values mean to people, because they are just sort of nominalizations, aren't they? And they can mean different things to different people. So we start off by kind of ironing that out a little bit, or looking at not necessarily that we have to agree, but just recognizing that we don't always agree on what each value means to people. And so that opens up the conversation as well. So I think there's various forums or formats we can use. Some of them are already built into Scrum, like the retrospective, and some we would add on. Time to just time to grow, if you like. I wouldn't call it team. I know that team building is a common phrase, but it's not so much about building. I think it's more organic than that. So a team growth session or something like that. You'll be unwary of all of these terms, because they get they become quite bland if we just sort of use them. Do a personal development session. Everyone has a different idea of what that means. Some people will cringe when they hear that and go, "Oh God, no, please." I cringe when I hear team building. I do not want to go on a. What brings to mind when I hear team building is going on some outward bounds course and swinging from ropes and playing the trust falling game. And I think, no more, please. I don't want to do that anymore. But it might not be that. It might be something completely different, and until I learn what that is. But the language we use, we've got to be a bit careful with sometimes, because all language has history and it has individual personal history. So I hear a word and it's going to trigger me in a certain way that it won't trigger someone else, or trigger them differently. And so kind of trying to bypass some of the standard language that we use over and over again and coming up with new language that makes people think, what is that? So rather than calling it a personal development or a team building day, we can call it I don't know, a values creation day, because no one's ever heard of that. They go, what's that? They're going to ask. Well, they got to ask. It sounds a bit weird. So let's at least, then you've got conversation happening. Right, but if you say, "Hey guys, we're going to do team building," you've got a few people switching off before you even begin. So choosing language.
The irony then is that the new language also becomes
Well, it will. Yeah, of course it will. That's why it's important to keep it alive. I mean, metaphor's like that, isn't it? Metaphor dies in overuse, and it becomes incorporated into the language. The word server, for example, is a metaphor, but we don't think of it as a metaphor anymore. Now it's just the thing. But it used to be a metaphor. So what's this machine like that passes data from one place to another? Well, it's a bit like someone who's serving you at a restaurant. So let's call it a server, right? And that's it. That's the metaphor, right? Lovely metaphor, actually. But now it's not. It's no longer a metaphor. Now it's fallen into standard usage. And so it's lost its poetry, essentially. When that happens, you lose the poetry. And so that's when it's important to develop new metaphors to keep the poetry in motion. Otherwise it all gets a bit prosaic.
And that's something that religion does well, right? It understands when you have a good imam, rabbi, priest, leader, community figure standing at the front and delivering a good sermon. It tends not to be, well, you're not doing this really precise thing well enough. And, I think it tends to be, let me tell you a story. And in that story, I'll illustrate something true. And it will be about, like you mentioned with the retrospective, like the values. It will be about something bigger, make you think, well, have we really lived up to these values or not? And it will question, and it won't presume to know the answer, but they'll help you orient to the smaller tasks by situating them within something bigger and something more.
Absolutely. I mean, a good preacher of any persuasion uses story absolutely in that way. They inspire you through storytelling. They don't lecture. A sermon isn't a lecture. where you're being like told off, or even, or kind of called to task, but not directly. But yeah, the stories that, and of course, a
Mm.
Christian preacher would use stories from the Bible, but not exclusively. You know, I've been to some wonderful, heard some wonderful sermons over the years where people go right outside of that zone and, to, you know, use pop culture or fairy tales or tales from some other faith, even, you know, a Buddhist tale or a Sufi tale, and bring those into the lecture and just as, or fables, you know, Aesop's fables is another way of understanding the world better. Yeah. So you're right. So what you said there, Daniel, was religion does this really well, and I think that's a great point to make. Actually, is like that it does do it really well. It gives us the ability to live in poetry much more than we would if we lose that. I think because we've got to really consciously continue to innovate with our metaphorical use of language. Not to the point where it confuses people and locks them out, or we're not trying to be clever with this, but we are trying to cause a wakefulness in people, you know, and get away from complacency. Because if we keep using the same metaphor, like people still use the metaphor of a war room when they want to come together and collaborate, and it's one of the most horrible metaphors, I think. A war room. You're like, who are you fighting? Come on, let's just like find a new way of describing that room because it might inspire people in a different way. And yeah. So it sort of drives, in a way, it drives the culture, doesn't it? The language we use drives the culture we have. If we have a culture that's talking about war rooms and firefighting all the time, you can imagine the kind of organization it's going to be. Um, as I say that, can't you? But there's another different kind of organization that might talk about collaboration space and and or listening space or something like that.
An operating theatre or
It's intriguing.
I don't know. I'm trying to think what could some of those metaphors be that what could we replace war room firefighting with something that feels less frantic?
Operating theatre. That was an interesting. That's a calm one, isn't it? It's got to be pretty crucial though. Operating theatre. Yeah. I don't know. You know, I think that the language, some of that new language should emerge from the culture itself and the people doing the work. It's their language. It needs to be their language. But as a consultant or coach coming in, you can certainly make suggestions based on observation. But in being careful not to say, oh, that worked over here in that company, so I'm going to bring it here. I think it's really important that organizations develop their own way of thought. This came to me once, years and years ago, I think 2007 or something. I read about a team, a Scrum team, and every time they finished their sprint, one of the team members would write a haiku to describe the sprint. That was the thing they set themselves, and then they would read it at the end, and they would then, you know, celebrate the sprint review, and it all sounded like, you know, lovely working environment. And I thought that's cool, writing a haiku. So I went to the team I was working with, and I said, "Hey, let's try this at the end of the sprint." And they all looked at me like I was like, "There's no way we're doing that, right? Just shut up, right?" And this wasn't a negative group of people. They were people who, but I realised it wasn't their idea. It didn't come from them. You know, it was me inflicting what I thought was a good idea. And I wasn't even a developer. I was a Scrum Master. So, yeah, I learned from that. Let's hold back on, you know, forcing my ideas onto people, and instead ask what might do. I could have talked about it in the way that I read about this other team doing that, rather than saying, "Hey, let's us do this." It's very different, isn't it?
It's a good job that didn't work, because if it would have worked, then we would all be spending all our time going on the Tobias Mayer haiku writing courses.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't have the skills to do that, but you know, I actually have done haiku writing workshops at Agile events before. So maybe you don't see those sorts of things so much, but in the early days of the Agile conferences, there was a lot of improv. There were 3 or 4 different people, including myself, who was teaching improvisation. There were poetry sessions. And I think that uh, a lot of that ties in really closely with software development. The early Agile conferences had more software developers. Nowadays, it seems to be all project management people and Scrum Masters, but back then it was a lot more developers. And so improvisation, there was even ballroom dancing, um, couples dancing, in order to teach pair programming. It was
Wow.
amazing. Yeah, I remember waltzing around the room with a very large Indian man, and in order to learn about pair programming. So ballroom dancing, improvisation, poetry writing were all considered, useful ways of learning how to be a better software developer. They still are useful. I mean, I don't know. I haven't been to an Agile conference for a while, so I don't know if those sorts of things are still happening. But I remember when I first was a coder, when I first discovered coding on my own, I would print out my programs because I like to look at them. Because to me, they were like, it was like poetry. They looked like poetry. It's like visual poetry, and I was fascinated by the look of them. And so, when working with coders, I'm always encouraging people to think haiku like in their poetry. Like, what's the smallest amount of instructions you can give the computer to do this? Which is what a haiku is, isn't it? It's the smallest amount of words you can express an idea in. And so I think actually haiku writing for software developers is very powerful. I don't run that workshop though.
That can be our next joint venture. Also, like our users' experience are experiences of humanity. They're experiences of poetry much more than they are experiences of prose. So if we have our teams and we're saying to them, you need to stop all this. Well, we never encourage the poetry element, and we think in terms of prose, in terms of requirements, in terms of like rational design. Well, then we'll create humanless, difficult to interact with, non-joyful products at the end of it. So if we want to harness and understand the humanity, the expression, the limits of joy that we want to be, or even just ease or simplicity or whatever that we want to elicit in our users, then we need to find that some way in ourselves, so that when we're sitting there making the programs, making the apps and all that kind of stuff, we're doing that with, and you speak about this, like a craftsman or a craftsperson mentality rather than an engineer mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that idea. That's, you could use the haiku model. It's 3 lines. Traditional haiku, you could use that for a user story, couldn't you? As a I want so that. You could haikufy that structure. That would be it would not to say that you'd get the perfect user stories from that, but it would be an exercise in understanding the true nature of what you're asking for. Because too often with user stories, they're vague. People don't know what they're asking for. They don't know who the user is, or the user isn't the one the one they identify as the user isn't the one that gets the value, because they haven't kind of made those connections. And I think that turning them into poems might be one way of doing it. Do you know, it reminded me though of a product owner. There's more than once actually it's happened. I want you to help me to write better user stories. And I never know what they mean by that. But I think what they mean is they want perfect requirements, essentially. And so my offer in return is I won't do that, but I will help you write worse user stories, because worse user stories are much better for dialogue, for engaging with the developers. If you write a bad user story, the developer's going to come and say, I don't understand this. It doesn't make any sense. And then you've got a conversation going. If they think they understand it, they're going to just go off and do the work, and it may or may not be the right thing. So anything you can do to bring people together. So product owners out there, write bad user stories, write rubbish user stories, right? Get it all wrong. And you'll have fantastic conversations, and you will improve the art of understanding how to ask for things. There you go. My advice to product owners.
Tobias, how can we use the Bible as a guidebook for organizational change?
Well, I've taught a workshop, a whole one-day workshop, more than once, a few times now, on organizational change using a specific book, which is the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels, but it's also the one that has this immediacy about it. Like, it's really urgent. There's an urgency and an immediacy about Mark's Gospel, about the change that needs to happen in the world. It's about the this character, the main character, Jesus of Nazareth, waking up to the fact that things are not right in the world, and forming a bond of people to kind of go with him and find ways of changing that. And so there's a lot of overlap really, and similarities and comparisons, and of what we're doing in our organization is a small group of people who see that there's a need for change, and how do we go about it? And it's urgent. It's not like we can wait years for this. It's like it has to happen now. So I think that that there's a lot of stories and parables within. The less parables actually in Mark than some of the other ones, but the narrative itself, it just takes you through this urgency thing. And I think that so we can use obviously that's just one example of that, but it does, for me, that's use the term organizational change, so that one worked for me for that. A colleague of mine, a good friend, Haroon Khalil, is running a workshop soon on the I think, well, it was his original title, which is lovely. I don't know if he's kept it. It's called "Let My People Flow," and it's about leadership based on the story of Moses. And the book of Moses, actually, not the book of Moses, the story of Moses in the 3 books he features in, is a story of leadership, but it encompasses so many different styles of leadership throughout that book. Sort of full commanding leadership, hands-off leadership, servant leadership, reluctant leadership. That's a very big part of Moses' story. So I think we can pull out lots of different lessons about leadership through reading those 3 books. Whether it be Exodus, well, 2 really, Exodus and the book of Numbers is where Moses really shows up in. Yeah, so different aspects in different books would help to do that. So long as you've got people in your organization who are open to it, and Haroon is a Muslim, and so he's teaching from his faith perspective, but it's not that much different to yours or mine. It's the same book, right? It's pretty much the same story. It's the same story, isn't it? It's just told slightly different ways, probably, but. Yeah, so so there's already 3 faiths in there, but and then if you're not of a faith at all, you can just kind of treat it as story. This is an ancient story about a particular group of people who were. I mean, I love this. I love the overall narrative of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. I'm talking about now, is that it's a story about a group of people who want to do the right thing and really struggle and keep falling away, they keep falling off the path. And then they need these individual people, these prophets, to come in and say, hey, you kind of like went over there and you should be going here. We've got this pathway, we've got this way of living that's been given to us, and we keep screwing up and messing up on it. So it's a continuous story of falling away and being called back, and falling away and being called back. And I think that's all of us now. That's us. It's us over the ages as well. But we have to identify, what is it? What is our purpose? What is our meaning? What is our way forward? What are our stone tablets? What is our law that we need to follow? And I think that's what people get lost on. We don't know today. Don't know what that is anymore.
If we look more at that story of Exodus and Moses, and we touched a little bit on this earlier, we get into ideas of liberation and freedom. And I know that one of the ways you often describe Scrum is as a liberating, revolutionary idea. Your book is The People's Scrum, right? It's a upswelling. What do you see as the connection, comrade, between the kind of liberation stories that we might find in the book of Exodus and the way that you see Scrum and agility?
Well, we just did a session on the slavery thing, didn't we, Daniel? And one of the things that really resonates with me from that story and looking at the corporate world is this narrative that we feel oppressed, or we're being held back, and the organization is oppressive, and it's too controlling. Command and control is the thing you hear all the time. And yet when people are often offered the freedom, they don't want to take it because it's too scary. Just like it was for the Israelites coming out of Egypt, it was like, yeah, let's go, but wait, I don't like it here. There's no food and there's nowhere to go. And we were safe back there. Yeah, we were slaves, but we were safe. And so selective memory starts coming in. There's a few different situations of this, but there's one in particular where an organization decided to change the way they operated and become more agile in their way of working. And they said to the developers, you can make the decisions now about all these different things that we're going to do, and we're going to put that process in place where anyone can make any changes they want to, providing they get kind of run it by a couple of people, the decision process. So it comes out of Lelou's book. And none of the developers wanted to do this, and they didn't do it. And so nothing changed. And the management were really puzzled. Why are these people, they got this total freedom now they can make the rules up, and they're complaining, but they could change it, but they won't change it. And when we sort of drilled into it a little bit, it was like, well, what were the conditions in which you hired them? And of course, they were hired on the basis that it's a 9 to 5 job, writing code. You've got a manager. There's your manager. He's going to tell you what to do, and you do it, and you get rewarded at the end, right? That was the conditions they signed up for. And so what they did is they switched it, didn't they? They just said, oh, you're not going to do that anymore. Didn't ask them. They just said, oh, we're going to do agile now, so you don't have a manager, and you get to make all your choices. Well, people didn't want that. So I didn't sign up for this. You're asking me to manage myself. Where's my higher salary for being a manager? That didn't come with it. There was no offer there. So it created a lot of resentment. And no, I'm not going to do that. And so the whole system fell apart. And I don't know, they went back to what they were doing before probably. But and this is what people have been writing a lot about recently. It's invitation. We lack invitation sometimes. It's Dan Mezek writes about this a lot. You don't just tell people. You don't force things on people. Right? People don't resist change. They resist coercion. Right? So let's remember that. Right? People say, "Oh, people don't want to change." They do want to change. They want to change when it makes sense to change. Right? They want to change by being invited into a conversation about change, not to be told to change. Yeah, we don't do that in our lives. Well, sometimes we do it. If we do it in our relationships, they don't tend to last very long. If my wife came down, we were going, I said, oh, you can't wear that. That's not going to work. No, you're not wearing that. No, not going out with you like that. Wouldn't be a very good relationship, would it? Well, we do that in the workplace. You can't do that anymore. You're going to do this instead. All right. So we're not going to work in that. We're going to work this way. But where's my part in that conversation? You forgot. I'm a person and I work here, and you didn't talk to me about this.
And I was getting something from that old system.
Yeah, exactly. Very often people are, aren't they? Yeah.
It's kind of the problem with this whole agile transformation idea, isn't it? That you can come in and say, right, let's move towards agile. That is better. And I think Dave Snowden talks a lot about this, the idea that you can't just come in and transform something without there being horrible or unintended consequences, most likely. And you're much better off navigating that complexity with small iterative changes. Let's move more in that direction and see what happens. Then let's try and tell more stories like these stories and less like those stories. And let's shift ourselves one piece at a time. And as a manager or as a leader or as a CTO or a CEO, it's hard to get the budget for that, right? It's hard to, you can't bring a management consultancy in. They're not selling small, incremental, uncertain, unlikely changes that won't look like what you expect when they're done. But the other stuff doesn't work either. And I think, that model of, well, if you took the Israelites out of Egypt and gave them freedom and they still, what's that bit where they say, well, at least we had cucumbers back in Egypt. You're trying to starve us to death here. We had cucumbers and we had watermelons and it was brilliant.
Garlic and fish.
Yeah, it was marvelous.
Yeah, well, I think Dave Snowden's spot on with that. It's that organisation could have benefited by listening to one of his talks before they made that change, because they did exactly what he's saying don't do, which is just like overnight, just sort of shift it from one thing to another. Of course, there's going to be resistance. There isn't resistance though if you invite people into a conversation. Say, look, and you don't start off by saying we need to change. You start off by saying what we're doing now. How well is it working? You ask the question. On a scale of 1 to 10, if you can think of a perfect way of working, are we there? And if no one's saying 10, then you've got somewhere to go. If everyone says a 9, you go, oh, it's great. We're almost there. So what are the little tweaks we have to make? If everyone's saying a 1, you go, okay, well, that's a different story we need to start telling now. And but I think if we don't begin by having a conversation with the people who are in the organization doing the work, we're always going to fail. You might drag a few people along, where there might be people who have been dying for that change to happen anyway, who are happy about it. And then there's also going to be a lot of people who really don't like it. And they sabotage it too. Not only do they not engage, but they can actively disengage and cause all kinds of problems. I saw that the very, very first Scrum team, one of the very first Scrum teams I worked with, there was like 3 I was working with. There was 2 developers who didn't want to do it, weren't consulted about it, were just told they're in it, and they just sabotaged it. when we were doing things like estimation, they were dragging it out and putting massive, like, long, like, this is going to take 5 weeks to do, and everyone else is saying it's going to take a day, and just like finding ways to slow things down and make it not happen. So obviously they had to go, not from the organization, but from the team. And they were happy. They didn't lose their jobs. They just got what they saw as better jobs in the organization, where they could do what they were told, not have to think for themselves.
Yeah.
So we must invite people in.
It's often it's a slower journey, isn't it? It's much easier to say, hello, I'm your new Scrum Master and you're going to do Scrum now. And this is what it looks like. Come on, jump on board and have a go. In the process, you may trigger some really crucial things for people that you don't realize. You may trigger various sort of traumatic working memories and experiences that they've had. And you've taken something that may have worked in their mind pretty well for 10, 15 years and completely upended it, and now left them in a new world where they don't know which way is up and down. And it's much better, in my experience, to go a lot slower and to make sure that maybe you won't make the change as quickly as you want, or more likely your manager wants, but you'll bring the whole team along with you, and any change you do make will be solidified and will be bought into, even if it feels maybe less ambitious than the big transformation that I can promise.
Yeah. It's like, if we look at the book of Exodus, there's not, to my memory, there's nothing in there about the rest of how many ever it was, 2 million Israelites being consulted about, do you want to leave Egypt or not? I don't think anyone had that conversation, did they? It was just that God set the conditions up in such a way that they had to leave. And so maybe, that's part of the resentment of wanting to want to go back. I was all right. I got fed, and it was hard work, but they fed us, and you're making it. In fact, there are examples in that book on there at the beginning when they complain about Moses. It got worse since you came in. They're making us do more work since you came. Go away. We don't want you here. Try to, push him out rather than inviting back.
Moses came and
there's a lot of conflict.
Moses came and challenged Pharaoh, and they said, right, we're going to double the workload. And then they say to Moses, like, who are you? Exactly. Like, you're not from here, you're not part of this group, you are like this Egyptian looking person. In the context of the story, he was Egyptian looking.
You came from outside our culture.
Yeah, you came from outside this internal culture there, and you're imposing this change, and it's making everything worse for us. Like, we were better off before you came here. And it's, it wasn't a straightforward story.
And for his part, Moses was also didn't want to do this, did he? He was like, don't pick me, God. I can't do this. I can't even speak properly. Don't pick me. And but he does anyway, and so he just sort of surrenders to it. But I think there's some interesting lessons in there about coercion and control, and so do we want to have an organizational change where everyone's now in the Sinai complaining? That doesn't sound like a good change, does it? That doesn't sound like a positive thing. So what's another way of doing it? So I think that, it's not like we look at the Bible and say, we have to live by what they do. We're looking at the stories and saying, how does it apply? What can we learn from this? Did they do the right thing? Was it difficult? Could they have done it differently? Could Moses have taken the Israelites out of Egypt iteratively, one sprint at a time?
We'll take you outside of Cairo, and then we'll take you a little bit further east, and then we'll at some point we'll do the release planning where we cross into the desert. And
we'll come back for the rest of you later. We're going.
Yeah, we're gonna get the most important ones to the promised land, and then we'll come back and do the rest. And some of you might stay behind. Yeah, maybe that doesn't quite do the same thing.
Yeah, you can have fun with it. You can have fun with it. But it starts to get us to think about, that there are good approaches, and there are less good, I wouldn't say bad, but less good approaches. And we don't really know what those approaches should be. This is the whole point of doing agility, where we don't know. We start off by saying, I don't know. So what's the smallest change we can make that's going to have some impact and can be measured and give us some data that we can use for the next change? And so that's how we want to approach it. It's not in this big bang way, because it does end in tears quite often. And I think that's a good lesson to draw out of the Exodus story. It all ends up okay in the end, but it took 40 years, and that's a long. We haven't got that time in our corporate.
Even then, it didn't end up so okay for the Jebusites and the Hittites and the other people.
Well,
maybe that's one for another time.
On which angle you're looking at it.
Well, I'm interested in this because from from the idea of the People's Scrum and it being a revolutionary act, how can you have an iterative revolution, Tobias? Don't you need to have a big, shocking event, a big leaving of Egypt, even if there's some fallout from that, in order to have the kind of people's revolution that can set us for the utopia?
I don't think you do, No, I don't think you do. There's a man called Eamon Hennessy, who's sort of a bit of a hero of mine. He calls himself the one-man revolution. And he basically just resisted. The things he didn't want to do, he didn't do. He didn't agree with the taxation system in America at the time. So he couldn't choose not to pay tax, but he could choose not to work. Right, so he goes and lives in a shed in the middle of the countryside where he doesn't have a job. He doesn't earn enough money to pay tax, and so he's resisting in these small ways. So yes, he's resisting in iterative ways. Each time he learns something new, he says, "Well, do I like that? Do I not like that? I'm going to resist that," and so he'll add another layer of resistance to it. And I think that here's my example of trying to do the Eamon Hennessy thing. When I was working at a Silicon Valley company, they had a rewards system where every quarter you'd be measured by all the usual ways of doing it, and you would be given points out of 1 to 5 or something. And if you got a 1, you usually got fired, and if you got a 5, you got a bonus, and so on. And so I really dislike those systems. I find them really toxic, but I couldn't change it. But what I could do is my manager said, and I'll meet with you and I'll tell you what your score was. And I said, well, okay, so let's stop there. I'll meet with you, but I don't want to know what my score was. I said, it's not interesting to me, so don't tell me. I said, I'm not looking for a bonus. When I started here, the agreement I made with you was that this is how much I was going to get paid. And I was happy with that. That's why I took the job. We could reassess my salary in relation to, outside inflation, but I'm not looking for a bonus. So I don't need to know whether I was a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And she said, but you have to. I have to tell you. It's part of my job. I said, but you could hold it back, couldn't you? It wouldn't hurt anybody. I don't want to know. And so she reluctantly agreed and didn't do that. And I was quite happy. I didn't know. My colleagues, well, what did you? I said, I don't know what I got, and I was free. I didn't, it was on my profile on the thing, but I didn't look at it, and I just didn't know what my ratings were the whole 2 years I was working there. So that was an act of resistance, right? That's revolutionary, because it changed something for one person. It changed something for her. She saw that this wasn't the perfect system for everybody who works there. There were some people who were saying, no, I don't like it. And I told her why. I don't like the system. I think it's toxic, and I think it drives the wrong behaviors. And towards the end of every quarter, people are not collaborating anymore. There's internal competition going on. People are not working to their best because they're not working with each other. They're just working so their manager notices them. I say drove all kinds of poor behaviors. And I said, I'm going to resist that, and I'm going to speak about it as well to you, So that's to answer your question. That can you iteratively have a revolution? I think you can, because maybe then someone else would hear about me doing that, or someone in my team, when they ask me what I scored and I don't know, they might say, oh, maybe I should do that too, because I'm finding this quite toxic. And so you can gradually influence, possibly. I didn't. That's by the by. No one else followed suit.
You might have been able to influence, but that's the thing. You can't change. Sometimes the best way to change the world is to change yourself and know that that's the thing that you have control over, and maybe that will radiate out in ways that you want. But you can't go and change the way that everyone else is all the time. You can really just start with that, and I think that's I
certainly used to think that Scrum would. This idea of the Kanban people, when they first started the Kanban movement, it was like, well, Scrum is revolutionary and Kanban is evolutionary. And I thought, well, yeah, it is. It's revolutionary and good for that. But I don't actually like that approach of changing everything overnight, as we just discussed. I never did like it, and I just thought that was how you're supposed to do it. But in reality, when I actually was in a situation where I was consulting with a small enough company to have influence, and that's not how we did things. It was about learning and education. much more, and engaging with people and finding out what was needed. Right, so it became, Scrum is also evolutionary. It doesn't have to be revolutionary. There are some initial changes you need to put in place, but you can do it pocket at a time. It's just like the best way to start Scrum, I think, is with one Scrum team. And this was Ken's advice too, Ken Schwaber, when he first came into Yahoo, where I was working at that time to help them initially. This is that 2005, 4 or 5, something like that. And he said, basically, give me your most broken project, your most difficult product, or the most important thing that you're working on, and we'll do Scrum with that, only that. But they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't give the most important one. They said, well, we got these 5 kind of half-ass things that you can work on. But you don't really get the impact. You don't see that was his concern. It's like, if you give me the most difficult problem, and I'll show you how Scrum really works. But if you're only giving me the ones you don't care about that much, you're not going to see the benefit in the same way. And they didn't, of course. So, but I think that approach of focusing on just one product, one team, one product, and showing that can work to the point where you don't have to promote Scrum anymore. You create an attractor, right? Because people then start to see it. That did actually work for me when I was working in New York for Business Week. Very old-fashioned structure company, and they did all the things that we know the corporate world do. But there was one person there who was purchased, as it were, as part of a startup, and they couldn't fire him, so they had to give him something to do. And they gave him this project to work on, and he said, "Oh, I want to do Scrum with this," because he knew about that. And so he brought in this team that I was part of, and we got on with it. Now, we were the only Scrum team in the whole organization, and not only that, but we were a Scrum team on a product that had 2 other teams that were not Scrum teams trying to do stuff. But what we were able to do with that, we didn't talk about it to anyone else. We just got on with it. We opened up a team room, put lots of stuff on the walls, the way Scrum teams used to do back in the old days, and lots of sticky notes and cards. And people started working together and sitting at the same table and pairing, and it was open. So there's a corridor there. People would walk by and they were puzzled because it wasn't like anywhere else. And so they were looking in and wondering what was going on and looking at the stuff on the wall. And they would say things like, can I do that? Can I have one of those in my cubicle? What are you guys doing? And so it started, and then we would do review meetings and say, well, come to the next review meeting. So we had big public review meetings, and the executives would bring they came and then they liked what they saw, and they come back the next week with their other executive friends, and it became a big sort of party. And after a few sprints of this, when people could see we were actually delivering working software fast and not documents, because the other 2 teams we were working with were presenting architectural drawings, and we were presenting working software. And so they could see it just was working, and so they said, let's do this more, on which developers would like to do it. And there were quite a few who would, because they've seen us. So it's basically the principle of attraction rather than promotion, right? We didn't promote it anymore. We just said, look, we're doing this. If you like it, you can do it too. And I think that's a lovely way to bring Scrum into an organization. You only need then, you need 5 or 6 people willing to join your team, and a product owner, and then off you go. And then you just make it compelling, really. You can change quite fast that way too. Go ahead. Yeah.
That only works in a situation where people can see what other people are doing, and maybe that stories like that are going to become fewer and further between the more that we do hybrid and remote working, and the fewer we talk about the water cooler moments almost as like a cliche, but they're really important. And the opportunity to walk past a team room and see what was going on and think, that looks great and I want it. It's hard to get that across on a hybrid world where the only window you get is a small sliver. We have to recreate it. Okay, maybe that's a question then. Let's take as a given there will be more hybrid working, there'll be more remote working as time goes on.
More remote even than hybrid even,
yeah.
I think.
How can we network our organizations and our people in ways that we were able to easily when everyone was in the same building, but we may struggle to in a remote world?
It's a great question to have people start to consider, isn't it? Because I don't know how you would do that. I think the Scrum review meeting is certainly one way of making things public. and not just the stuff you've built, but the energy you can bring into that meeting can also influence, I think, as well. But apart from the review meeting, there's no other formal place for that to happen. But you do, like you said, you do lose the, I'm just walking up to the coffee room and I want to, or even after a while, I wonder what those weird Scrum guys are up to. Let me go and check them out, And so you lose that. You don't have that opportunity anymore. Can't do that online, I don't suppose, can you?
Yeah. When I was at Cancer Research UK, there would be these big stand-up meetings with each department, or each sort of directorate would have, like, I don't know, 200 people just sort of almost spontaneously gather and change the energy about the place. You would walk into that corner of the building and there'd be like 200 people around their desks looking at some presentation that was going on. It was nice. You would say, you'd see people walking there and you say, where are you going? They go, oh, we're going to the big departmental stand-up. You go, all right, I'll come along. Why not? And put your stuff down and go along, and you'd learn something.
Yeah. Menlo Innovations, that company, I think they're part of one of Lou's books, a software development company, and they embraced Agile in the early days and XP, and they created a pretty decent culture there. But they used to do open days where people would come for tours of the company. And so anyone who was sort of like, I've heard about Menlo Innovations, they sound like they're doing some cool stuff. And so you could sign up for one of the tours. I think they started charging after a while because there's so many people who wanted to do it. And they would take them around and let them watch the software developers at work and the walls with the stuff and that. So after they had that tour, then they were sort of in a position to say, oh, I might try that in my organization. So I suppose you could do something like that virtually, like have your virtual team room open for an hour a week or something, and invite people to come and watch you, just observe you, just be on the Zoom call, but just to sort of watch. I don't know how that would work, but off thinking on my feet, that's the only thing I could come up with. But I bet that people could, if you pose that problem to teams, how do you show what you're doing to the world so they want to do it too, and let people come up with some solutions to that.
Because the alternative is to have a sort of constraint that you put in where you say, if you work here as a software developer, you have to spend a day, a month shadowing another team doing something differently, which may come with its own, unintended consequences, but otherwise things like that. The more I think about it, the more I think if I was running a startup, I would insist on a lot of hybrid work and the occasional remote work. And that's as someone that has done most the last 4 years of my career, which is about half of my career has been remote, mostly. You miss something. I feel for the Scrum Masters and delivery managers and Agile coaches nowadays that have never had in-person retrospectives, in-person planning, and they think that the whole thing, their only perspective on it is online meetings, and you miss something so important.
Yeah. Well, we've got 10 minutes, Daniel. What do you want?
I would like to continue the practice that I've been doing for the last few episodes, which is to ask my guests for feedback on how this experience was for you as a guest on this podcast. What went well? What didn't go well? How do you think I could improve as a podcast host? No wrong answers.
I thought it went really well. I enjoyed myself. The time flew by, actually. It's almost 2 hours. I felt that you were a really good listener, actually. You had minimum interrupts and you had enough pause to allow me as a speaker to think and not just sort of jump in afterwards. So that felt good, actually. I noticed that. And then you did, occasionally you did come in with a comment or something, but if I started talking, you'd back off. So you prioritized your guest, the voice of your guest, certainly. And it was very interesting, actually. Yeah, it was interesting and very noticeable. So thank you for that, first of all. So I did enjoy. And I think the questions were, we had a little bit of preparation, tiny bit, very, very little actually, didn't we? 5-10 minutes or so, just a quick chat. But I think the focus was good. You kept the focus on the idea of faith within the context of the mind and the agile ways of working. So how the brain works and how agile works, if you like, with all of that. So it's not just like going off on a kind of religious crusade or something. It was always contextualizing it, and I think you bringing that back and asking good questions about that. So it felt very natural. It felt, it was a good conversation.
Were there any bits that felt a bit stickier, a bit harder to navigate, or things that I could improve?
Nothing's jumped out at me, to be honest. I will think about it, and maybe when I watch the recording back, I might see something. But no, there wasn't anything that really jarred with me. It felt the little bit of preparation we did was important. I think that if we hadn't done that, it might have not gone.
Yeah, I think you were the first person I tried that with, so it's maybe I'll do that more to make sure that everyone gets 5 minutes to just be like, this is let's make sure we understand the scope and we know what we're talking about there now.
Because for me, especially setting what the expectation was, because it went from what I thought was quite focused to something that was very open, big, but it came back to this, which is very focused, and I think within the first 5 minutes of watching this, people are going to kind of go, I don't want to see this, it's not up my street. So they'll get a very clear picture straight away of what's in store. But if they are intrigued by it, then I think it does a nice job of building on those initial.
Hopefully not everyone will say that after the first 5 minutes, but the important thing is that the people that are listening to this bit will be the people that liked it. So, nothing lost there.
Yeah, no, I love what you're doing, Daniel. I love that you're creating these podcasts and you're having some, I haven't listened to them all, but I sort of dip in and I read what you've written about the interview as well. You've got some really unusual guests. It's not the usual group of people. The last one with a creative writer was very interesting.
It was with Laura Stroud.
And I think that, the tying it in with the blog, with the Substack thing as well is great.
Thanks, Tobias.
Yeah, no, you're doing some good stuff.
Where can people find out more about you and your work and your writings?
tobiasmayer.uk.
Wonderful, and I will.
That's my website. I also have scrum.academy, which is where I do, where I do my consulting work from. So 2 websites. Very easy URLs to remember.
Wonderful, and I'll link them in the show notes. Tobias Mayer, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Agile on the Mind podcast with me, Daniel Susser, and our guest, Tobias Mayer. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack blog. If you want to receive a weekly newsletter with ideas like these about cognitive science and building brilliant teams, subscribe at agileonthemind.substack.com. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to it on. We'll see you next time.